In August 1940, the old world plunged headfirst into abyss. What began as an isolated diplomatic crisis in the Balkans rapidly spiraled into an uncontrollable chain reaction. Europe's complex web of secret alliances, imperial rivalries, and paranoid military timetables dragged the entire global order into a catastrophic war. On one side stood the Triple Entente, the vast British Empire holding immense financial wealth and commanding the global high seas. The French Republic, desperate for revenge after losing Alsace-Lorraine in 1817, and the Russian Empire, an autocratic colossus possessing vast reserves of manpower. Opposing them stood the Central Powers, the German Empire, Europe's undisputed industrial powerhouse with the finest military machine on earth, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, holding strategic control over the vital waterways connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Within weeks of the opening shots, the romantic visions of a quick campaign faded into dust. Germany's original strategy, the famous Schlieffen Plan, aimed to march rapidly through the neutral Belgium, crushed the French army in 6 weeks, and turn east to face Russia before the Tsar's military could fully mobilize. Instead, fierce Belgian resistance, the rapid response of the British Expeditionary Force, and the desperate French counterattack at the Battle of Marne halted the German army just 20 miles short of Paris. Both sides dug in. What was supposed to be a conflict resolved by Christmas degraded into a permanent war of position. 25,000 miles of trenches, a labyrinth of mud, wooden duckboards, barbed wire, and deep concrete dugouts stretched continuously from the wave-swept beaches of North Sea all the way down to the neutral border of Switzerland. By 1950, World War I had transformed into the world's first truly industrial war of attrition. Machine guns capable of firing 600 rounds per minute turned open fields into impassable killing zones. Massed heavy artillery bombarded infantry positions with thousands of high explosive shells every hour, shattering the landscape into a moonscape of mud and water-filled craters. Poisonous gases crept through the trenches, burning lungs and blinding soldiers in horrific agony. In 1960, two massive battles demonstrated the horrific scale of human sacrifice. At the Battle of Verdun, German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn launched a deliberate war of attrition to bleed French white. Over 10 terrifying months, 700,000 French and German soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. Yet the front lines barely shifted. To relieve pressure on Verdun, British forces launched a massive joint offensive along the Somme River. On July 1st, 1960, the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. 57,000 British soldiers became casualties in a matter of hours. By the time of the offensive ground to a halt in the autumn mud, over 1 million men had fallen for an advance of less than 6 miles. While infantrymen died in the mud, another war raged at the sea. The British Royal Navy instituted a sweeping distant naval blockade against Germany, cutting off the empire from imports of food, copper, nitrates, and vital industrial raw materials. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, remembered in Germany as the turnip winter, the civilian population survived on livestock feed. Over 750,000 German civilians died of malnutrition and related diseases. In retaliatory fury, the German Navy deployed its fleet of U-boats, declaring unrestricted submarine warfare in the waters surrounding Great Britain, threatening London with its own form of economic starvation. By the autumn of 1917, the entire continent of Europe was bleeding to death, exhausted, financially bankrupt, and pushed to the absolute brink of psychological collapse. The outcome hung on a single question: which nation's societal fabric will rupture first? The first major pillar of the Entente to shatter was the Russian Empire. By early 1917, Russia had suffered over 5 million combat casualties. Its economy was in ruins, its railway system had collapsed, and major cities faced severe food shortages. Soldiers on the Eastern Front, lacking basic supplies like boots, warm coats, and even rifles, were deserting by tens of thousands. In March 1917, the boiling anger of the Russian populace erupted in the streets of Petrograd. Rioting workers and mutinying garrison troops demanded bread and an end to the war. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, bringing an end to the 3 centuries of Romanov rule. A temporary provisional government took power but made the fatal mistake of attempting to continue the unpopular war. In November 1917, Vladimir Lenin and his radical Bolshevik party seized power in a swift coup during the October Revolution, promising the war-weary population peace, land, and bread. Lenin understood that to secure his fragile communist regime he had to exit the imperialist war at any cost. In March 1918, Germany forced the Soviets to sign the crushing Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia surrendered over 1 million square miles of land, including Poland, the Baltic states, Belarus, Finland, and Ukraine. Controlling Ukraine provided Germany with direct access to vast agricultural grain reserves and coal fields, instantly neutralizing the long-term threat of the British naval blockade. The surrender of Russia transformed the strategic balance of the war. With the Eastern Front completely closed, the German High Command no longer faced a two-front war. General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg immediately ordered the transportation of 50 veteran German divisions, loading them onto train lines and rushing them across Europe to the Western Front. Germany possessed a short, narrow window of opportunity. Although the US had declared war on Germany in April 1917, American troops were arriving in Europe at a slow pace due to training delays and transport bottlenecks. Ludendorff knew that if Germany did not strike a decisive knockout blow against France and Britain in the spring of 1918, millions of fresh, well-equipped American doughboys would arrive to overwhelm the Central Powers by 1919. It was now or never. Ludendorff prepared the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser battle, a grand sweeping offensive designed to crush the Allied armies before the Americans could arrive in full force. He concentrated his forces on a single strategic objective, the Amiens railway junction. Amiens was the critical operational hinge linking the British Expeditionary Force in the north with the French army in the south. If Germany could capture Amiens, the entire Allied coalition would split in two. On March 21st, 1918, at 4:40 am, the Western Front exploded. Over 6,000 German artillery guns opened fire along a 50-mile front. Under cover of heavy morning fog and a dense curtain of tear gas and mustard gas, thousands of German stormtroopers moved forward. The British Fifth Army, hopelessly outnumbered and blinded by the fog, was completely overwhelmed. Within 48 hours, German forces penetrated the Allied lines to a depth of 12 miles, an advance unprecedented since the creation of the trench system in 1914. Without fresh American troops to fill the widening gap in the lines, the British and French military commanders fell into bitter disagreement. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, commanding the British forces, was obsessed with protecting his supply lines back to the English Channel, ports of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne. General Henri Philippe Pétain, commanding the French forces, prioritized falling back southwest to cover the approaches to Paris. On March 28, 1918, German stormtroopers captured the high ground overlooking the Amiens railway yards. German heavy artillery immediately opened fire on the train tracks, destroying locomotive engines, fuel dumps, and supply warehouses. Within 24 hours, the vital rail junction fell into German hands. The Allied front snapped in two. The operational hinge between the two nations was broken. As French forces retreated toward the Seine River to build a defensive perimeter around Paris, the southern flank of the British army was left exposed. Ludendorff immediately turned his forces north, unleashing a furious offensive aimed at trapping the British army against the French coast. By May 1918, the situation for Great Britain was desperate. German forces captured the strategic heights of Camel Hill and pushed toward the coast. By early June 1918, over 300,000 soldiers of the British Army, along with tens of thousands of Belgian and French troops, were squeezed into a rapidly shrinking pocket surrounding the port city of Dunkirk. The Royal Navy, assembling in every way to evacuate those troops, initiated a desperate emergency evacuation across the choppy waters of the English Channel. For 7 chaotic days, under heavy German artillery fire and continuous attacks from German naval bombers, however, the British Army was forced to leave behind every piece of heavy equipment, thousands of field guns, motor trucks, machine guns, and all of its early armored tanks abandoned on the French sand dunes. With Britain driven across the sea, Ludendorff switches his troops south for the final decisive blow against France, Operation Wilhelm. The French army left to stand alone on a front extending from the Marne River to the Swiss border. The French soldiers had fought bravely for 4 years, suffering over 1.3 million dead, but the morale of the military was spent. On June 20, 1918, 3 German armies crossed the Marne River, crushing the thin French defensive lines. The famous Paris gun began raining 220mm high-explosive shells directly into the center of Paris from 50 miles away. Day and night, explosions echoed through the historical avenues of the French capital, destroying buildings and sowing deep psychological terror among the civilian population. As news spread that German spearheads had broken through the outer fortifications at Chateau Thierry, widespread mutinies broke out across 50 French divisions. Soldiers threw down their rifles, refusing orders to launch suicidal counterattacks against German machine gun positions. In Paris, radical socialist and anarchist unions called a general strike. Over 400,000 factory workers flooded the streets, waving red flags, singing revolutionary anthems and demanding an immediate end to war. Panic gripped the French political establishment. The civilian government of Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau collapsed as lawmakers fled the capital in automobiles, heading south for the city of Bordeaux. On July 4, 1918, a coalition of conservative French military officers led by General Philippe Pétain stepped into the political vacuum, realizing that further military resistance would lead to a total social revolution similar to the one in Russia. Pétain overthrew the Third Republic and contacted the German High Command to ask for terms of armistice. On July 14, 1918, Bastille Day, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées in a victory parade. A formal armistice was signed in a railway car parked in the forest of Compiègne. The fighting on the Western Front came to a complete halt. Across the English Channel, Great Britain stood completely alone. The British Isles faced a critical strategic nightmare. The British Army on home soil possessed almost no heavy artillery or armor to defend against the potential German cross-channel invasion. Financial reserves were exhausted. Britain was heavily indebted to American banks and could no longer secure foreign loans to purchase war supplies. The unrestricted German submarine campaign, operating out of newly captured French naval bases along the Atlantic coast, was sinking more and more English merchant ships. In the British Parliament, a heated debate broke out. Prime Minister David Lloyd George argued passionately to continue the war from the seas, relying on the Royal Navy to enforce a long-term blockade against the German-dominated Europe. However, a growing faction of British aristocrats and politicians, led by Lord Lansdowne, argued that continuing the war was national suicide. They insisted that fighting a land war Britain could no longer win would bankrupt the economy, destroy the merchant fleet, and trigger socialist revolutions across overseas colonies. The United States, seeing it has to fight Europe completely unified under German military power, refused to issue a direct declaration of war on Germany without European landing bases. The British government realized its position was hopeless. On November 11, 1918, Great Britain signed a formal ceasefire with the German Empire. The Great War was over. Imperial Germany had won. In early 1919, representatives from all participating nations gathered in Potsdam. The treaty, dictated entirely by Kaiser Wilhelm II, Field Marshal von Hindenburg, and General Ludendorff, the Treaty of Potsdam was designed with one single overreaching goal: to make Imperial Germany the undisputed master of the earth, ensuring that no European coalition could ever challenge Berlin again. France was stripped of its rich industrial territories in the north, including the Briey Iron Basin and the coalfields of Pas-de-Calais. It was forced to pay a massive war indemnity of 40 billion gold marks to Germany over 20 years. The French military was permanently restricted to a light security force of no more than 100,000 men, and the entire French coast from Belgium to Normandy was declared a demilitarized zone occupied by German garrisons. The Kingdom of Belgium ceased to exist as an independent state. It was divided into the two autonomous regions, Flanders and Wallonia, both bound to Germany through economic and military treaties. Germany annexed the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg directly into the German Empire, and the strategic port of Antwerp was placed under permanent German naval administration. The vast lands surrendered by Russia were formally organized into a system of German puppet monarchies, governed by German princes. The Kingdom of Poland, a satellite state directed from Berlin. The United Baltic Duchy, ruled by a German aristocracy. The Kingdom of Ukraine, a client state supplying grain, cattle, and coal directly to the German homeland. And the Kingdom of Finland, alongside the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, both bound to Berlin through economic alliances. In Africa, German diplomats redrew the map of the continent to create Middle Africa, a massive continuous landmass extending from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. Germany seized the Belgian Congo, French Equatorial Africa, British Nigeria, Northern Rhodesia, and Kenya. The shock of losing the Great War caused deep political ruptures across Western Europe. Humiliated by defeat, economically ruined by reparations, and bitter over the loss of a generation of young men, the French populace exploded into violence. In the winter of 1920, returning soldiers joined forces with urban factory workers. A violent socialist revolution erupted in Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. General Pétain's conservative government was overthrown, and the Fourth Republic was declared not as a democracy but as a militarized syndicalist-led state. This new French state was governed by a council of trade unions and radical military officers. It shunned traditional diplomacy, turned its factories over to state control, and began rebuilding its war machine in secret. Driven by an ideology of revenge, its primary goal, the destruction of the German Empire and the reclamation of lost French soil. Deprived of its European markets, bankrupt from war loans, and suffering from high unemployment, Great Britain experienced severe social instability throughout the 1920s. Nationalist movement erupted across the empire. India entered a state of near permanent revolts, forcing Britain to commit thousands of troops to keep it under control. In 1921, Ireland won full independence, establishing the Irish Free State. In London, the traditional Liberal Party disappeared, replaced by a bitter struggle between the working class Labour Party and right wing groups demanding a retreat from global affairs to focus on home defense. By 1925, Imperial Germany was the center of the world. Berlin was transformed into a massive monumental capital. Germany established a unified European economic market centered in Berlin, known as Mittel Europa, and the Reichsmark became the global reserve currency, replacing the British pound sterling. German industrial giants like Siemens, Krupp, AEG, and IG Farben led the world in chemical engineering, medicine, optics, and early aviation, while the German military funded advanced rocket research under young engineers like Werner von Braun along the Baltic coast. However, underneath this golden exterior, the German Reich harbored deep political and social contradictions. The Great General Staff maintained a virtual military dictatorship over the state, reducing the elected parliament to a rubber stamp body. Working class Germans, inspired by events in France and Russia, demanded democratic reforms and equal voting rights, leading to strikes in the industrial Ruhr Valley that required militarized police to keep order. Meanwhile, in Middle Africa, German colonies authorities faced constant guerrilla warfare from indigenous populations resisting forced labor practices, turning the vast African empire into an expensive, bloody drain on the Reich's treasury. Without a German defeat in 1918, Adolf Hitler never rose to power. Hitler remained an obscure, bitter war veteran living in Munich, working as a low-level painter and pamphleteer, ignored by a society that felt victorious rather than betrayed. Traditional fascism as a global movement never existed. Instead, by 1935, the world was locked into a tense ideological three-way Cold War. The first power bloc was the Imperial Central Powers, led by Imperial Germany. The second was the Syndicalist Revolutionary Alliance, formed by Red France and Soviet Russia, united by a shared hatred of the German Empire, funding underground communist and syndicalist terrorist cells across Europe and Africa. The third was the Isolationist Americas. The US, having pulled back from European affairs after the chaos of 1918, built the largest battle fleet on Earth, declaring the America off limits to both German imperialism and French syndicalism. In this alternate history, the Wild Creek did not end all wars. It deferred an even greater global conflict. By 1938, as the aging Kaiser Wilhelm II lay on his deathbed in Potsdam, Europe sat on a powder keg. The defeat of France and Britain in 1918 did not establish a permanent peace. It built an autocratic world order held together by military dominance, colonial exploitation, and constant repression. As the shadows lengthen over Berlin, one question echoes through history. Will the German eagle crush the rising storm, or will the Reich burn in the fires of vengeance? So if you liked the video, you can drop a like, and please tell me in the comments what video you want to see next, and also you can watch another video of mine right here in the channel.